This morning, thinking of Gift Day, we were trying to encourage the children to take part in the act of giving. And my boys have their own little accounts, little pocket money accounts. And they said, well, we want to give. And I said, well, okay, why don't you ask God how much you think you should give? And they sort of had some prayer. And then they said, well, how do we give? And I said, well, I've got my phone. They said, well, can we take your phone and do the beeping? And I'm like, oh, hang on here. Okay, all right. It's a trust journey, this whole giving thing. Anyway, so I gave them my Google Pay, and they trotted over, and they were sort of there, kind of pressing into numbers and stuff, and I sort of sat there, and Si came over and whispered in my ear, 500, what do you say, 5 grand later? And I suddenly thought I might have to speak to Jackie tomorrow morning, like, Jackie, you know, like, the Benyons are really generous. Can you, like, return 96% of that back? Anyway, we'll see what happens. Brill. It's all good. You say that now. Father, thank you for your justice. We thank you for what you have been teaching us over the last few weeks about justice. And Lord, speak to us this evening in your name. We've been on a justice journey, as Si mentioned. We looked at justice in Genesis. We've looked at liberating justice. Do you remember Hannah spoke about God committed to God remembers, God sees, God acts, and God sends? Do you remember that? And then we talked about communities of justice, where we had a panel up here thinking about, well, what does justice actually, what can it look like in our church family, in our community? And last week, Si spoke about justice as an encounter. And he looked at a sequence of the life of Jesus, a picture of justice in action. If we want to understand what the life of justice looks like, we look at the life of Christ, seeing, hearing, feeling, and acting. And he asked this question, which has been in my mind this week, and maybe it's been in yours as well. He asked, how are we placing ourselves in situations where we will see, hear, and feel injustice so that we might act? It's a good question. It's a good question. And we've discovered that God's concern for justice permeates every part of Israel's life in the story of the Bible, and it should also permeate our lives as a church family and as our lives personally as well. So, Lord, would it permeate our lives? When I'm thinking of justice, I always look at the Bible Project as a good way into it. And we've covered quite a lot of material already. So I wonder, we're going to watching quite a lot of films this evening. But this is so good. And I think it encapsulates and it depicts in quite extraordinary ways what the story of justice looks like in the biblical narratives. And so I'd love you to watch this and ask the question as you watch it. The question is, how does the imagery speak to you? What is God saying through the imagery to you about justice? And you're going to share that just with someone next to you. Don't worry, it won't be scary. So over to the team. It's 5 minutes. I'm just going to pause so this doesn't count against me in my sermon time. Off we go.
If you were a praying mantis, it would be socially acceptable to devour your mate.
And if you're a honey badger, you have no regard for other animals. You don't care.
If you're a panda with twins, it's normal to abandon one to take care of the other.
But if humans do any of these things, we would call it wrong, unfair, or unjust.
Yeah, why is that? Why do humans care so much about justice?
Well, the Bible has a fascinating response to that question. On page 1, humans are set apart from all other creatures as the image of God.
Yeah, God's representatives who rule the world by his definition of good and evil.
And this identity, it's the bedrock of the Bible's view of justice. All humans are equal before God and have the right to be treated with dignity and fairness no matter who you are.
And that would be nice if we all did that. But we know how the world really works.
And the Bible addresses that too. It shows how we are constantly redefining good and evil to our own advantage at the expense of others.
Yeah, self-preservation. And the weaker someone is, the easier it is to take advantage of them.
And so in the biblical story, we see this happening on a personal level, but also in families, and then in communities, and in whole civilizations that create injustice, especially towards the vulnerable. But the story doesn't end there. Out of this whole mess, God chose a man named Abraham to start a new kind of family. Specifically, Abraham was to teach his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice.
Yeah, doing righteousness, that's a Bible word I don't really use, but what comes to mind is being a good person.
But what does that even mean, being good? The biblical Hebrew word for righteousness is tzedakah, and it's more specific. It's an ethical standard that refers to right relationships between people. It's about treating others as the image of God,
with the God-given dignity they deserve.
And this word justice, it's the Hebrew word mishpat. It can refer to retributive justice.
Like if I steal something, I pay the consequences.
Exactly. Yet most often in the Bible, mishpat refers to restorative justice. It means going a step further, actually seeking out vulnerable people who are being taken advantage of and helping them.
Yeah, some people call this charity.
But mishpat involves way more. It means taking steps to advocate for the vulnerable and changing social structures to prevent injustice.
So justice and righteousness are about a radical, selfless way of life.
Yeah, and you find this idea all over the Bible. Like here, in the book of Proverbs, what does it mean to bring about just righteousness?
Open your mouth for those who can't speak for themselves.
And what do these words mean for the prophets, like Jeremiah?
Rescue the disadvantaged, and don't tolerate oppression or violence against the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow.
And like here, look in the book of Psalms.
The Lord God upholds justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, and sets the prisoner free. But he thwarts the way of the wicked. Whoa, he thwarts the wicked?
Yeah, in Hebrew, the word wicked is rasha. It means guilty or in the wrong. It refers to someone who mistreats another human, ignoring their dignity as an image of God.
So justice and righteousness is a big deal to God.
Yes, it's what Abraham's family, the Israelites, were to be all about. They ended up as immigrant slaves being oppressed unjustly in Egypt. And so God confronted Egypt's evil, declaring them to be rasha, guilty of injustice. And so he rescued Israel. But the tragic irony of the Old Testament story is that these redeemed people went on to commit the same acts of injustice against the vulnerable. And so God sent prophets who declared Israel guilty.
But they weren't the only ones. There's injustice everywhere.
Yeah, some people actively perpetrate injustice. Others receive benefits or privileges from unjust social structures they take for granted. And sadly, history has shown that when the oppressed gain power, they often become oppressors themselves.
So we all participate in injustice, actively or passively, even unintentionally. We're all the guilty ones.
And so this is the surprising message of the biblical story. God's response to humanity's legacy of injustice is to give us a gift, the life of Jesus. He did righteousness and justice, and yet he died on behalf of the guilty. But then God declared Jesus to be the righteous one when he rose from the dead. And so now Jesus offers his life to the guilty so that they too can be declared righteous before God, not because of anything they've done, but because of what Jesus did for them.
The earliest followers of Jesus experienced this righteousness from God, not just as a new status, but as a power that changed their lives and compelled them to act in surprising new ways.
Yeah, if God declared someone righteous when they didn't deserve it, the only reasonable response is to go and seek righteousness and justice for others.
This is a radical way of life, and it's not always convenient or easy. It's courageously making other people's problems my problems.
This is what Jesus meant by loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about a lifetime commitment fueled by the words of the ancient prophet Micah. God has told you, humans, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
Great. What a great overview, isn't it? So good. Much of it we've already covered, but I wanted just to use that to encapsulate and draw on, and I'm going to pick up some of the things later. But what I'd love you to do now, for about a couple of minutes, minute or so, is just to turn to somebody near you, or if you're on your own, maybe turn around, and hopefully we can get to, just to say, I saw this image picked out, jumped out at me, and for this reason. Off you go. Great. I feel like being a teacher again. It's quite nice. You can do all the work. I wonder what you discussed. There's so many wonderful images in that depiction. I'm interested that all the figures were all fundamentally the same, all made in the image of God. We are beautifully equal in that sense. We've all created all peoples made in the image of God. The boxes of varying heights, maybe you talked about that, the different disparaging power dynamics in it. We start zoomed in, and then it zooms out, expressing the systemic issues within our world and in our systems of government and politics and all that. And I love the use of the two words, and we're going to think a little bit around these two words. The use of the Hebrew word rasha. Do you remember what that was? That was the guilty or those in the wrong, and that was depicted by the red ribbon. And then we had the mishpat, and they mentioned the two aspects of the word mishpat. The first one was retributive justice, which is a sort of eye for an eye. It's a kind of, you did this, boom, there's consequences for it. For that, you're in prison. The retributive justice, and we kind of love that, don't we? And somewhere deep in us, there is this retributive justice need to be expressed. But also, they talked about restorative justice, a justice that is relational at its core, that seeks connection with God and with other. It's characterized by compassion, by love, by courage, by forgiveness, and seeks transformation. And this is most beautifully expressed in the cross. And so that's what we're going to be looking at a little bit this evening. So Si, do you remember last week he said this? I'm quoting a lot of Simon this evening. Si said, when called to act, we're all missionaries. Do you remember him saying this? And he says, a missionary is not someone who crosses the sea, but who... They were listening. I wasn't. Everyone else was. No, it's a really good point, isn't it? A missionary is someone who doesn't cross the sea, but someone who sees the cross. So this evening, we're going to be looking at the cross. We're going to be gazing at the cross. We're going to be seeing God's radical, grace-filled vision for mishpat justice fulfilled in the cross. And I love this from John Newton, who wrote that wonderful hymn, Amazing Grace. He said this, may we sit at the foot of the cross and there learn what sin has done, what justice has done, and what love has done. So I'm going to use that just to create a little bit of shape to my talking this evening. We're going to be thinking a little bit about what sin has done, what justice has done, and what love has done on the cross. So what sin has done. I love in that picture that the red ribbon of rasha that guilt depicts, it not only lands on the baddies, which is Egypt in the story of Exodus, but did you notice that it also landed on the people of Israel as well? It's so easy to divide the goodies and the baddies and how we want to. For those of us who are driven, who have the instinct for retributive justice, is that we can separate the goodies and the baddies. I remember when I was sitting years ago with my kids, I've got 3 boys, and one of them, when we were watching a TV show, and it was very obvious, the baddie, and we had to sort of be careful because the baddies are quite scary. And he turned to me and he goes, Daddy, we're goodies, aren't we? Which is a really good question. And expecting me to go, yes, son, we're goodies. I said, well, sometimes it's not as simple as that. And his little face sort of crumpled as I sort of went all existential on him. And he looked at me, and I see in his little eyes this sort of, my daddy is a baddie. And I was like, well, it's not as simple as that. Well, in some ways, your daddy is a baddie. But he can be a goodie. Well, he was sort of made a goodie and became a baddie. Anyway, it was a bit of a disastrous moment. But how easily and how quickly we divide ourselves into goodies and baddies. But the Bible says, and we've been looking at Romans in the morning, and the Bible says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And in that sense, all are rasher. All of us are guilty. All of us have the red ribbon of guilt laid upon us. And that's the Christian worldview, isn't it? J. John, the evangelist, always said this, the heart of the problem is the problem of the human heart. He's got a slightly nasal voice, so he's sort of, the heart of the problem is the problem of the human heart. And he spoke a little bit like that. Sorry, J. John, he's a wonderful man. And the solution, if that is the problem, the heart is the problem. What is the solution? The solution is Christ. The solution is his forgiveness. The solution is the restoration, the mishpah, justice that we receive on the cross. But it's difficult to say that in our increasingly secular, post-Christian world, isn't it? The worldview or ideologies that are swarming around at the moment is quite different, and it doesn't always wash. The problems of humanity are the human heart. That's not the case. No. The problems of humanity are entirely down to structures and injustices in society. And if we fix those, then we will have justice. But it's not as simple as that. And the Christian worldview believes in restoring systemic injustices in the world and in the structures in our world, but also believes that actually it is through the cross, through the gospel, that restoration truly occurs. The current worldview is if there's no God, there's no judge who judges justly, and therefore we define what is right or wrong, we define what is good and evil, and we become the arbiters of truth, the arbiters of justice ourselves, and our arbitration has a strong bent towards retributive justice, doesn't it? And if there's no judgment in the afterlife, there's no true and good judgment, there is no afterlife, so we will mete out justice now. And most of us can agree in some way what justice is, but we find it difficult in our culture, I think, to agree on what injustice is. And that's where problems arise. And that's where we get things, and Si mentioned it last week, cancel culture, where from the paradigm of an ideology or a worldview where we have sort of goodies and baddies and polarized in very clear ways, we get people going, well, that is wrong, that is injustice, therefore we will cancel you according to the paradigm of our ideology. So, you know, J.K. Rowling or whoever who says, well, actually, I think we can define women, and suddenly she's cancelled on Twitter and all that, because she's received a meting out of justice, which is cancel culture. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. There's plenty of overlap between the social justice movement in our world, which is founded on critical theory, and biblical justice. But at its core, they are quite different. And as Christians, we do need to be aware that it isn't entirely the same. So we need to be mindful of that, particularly as these sort of culture wars swarm around us. If you want to go into a little bit more detail of this, I really recommend this essay by Tim Keller, a biblical critique of secular justice and critical theory. Haven't got time to go into critical theory, but I think it is worth us all really, if we're really interested in this topic and what biblical justice looks like, is to really dig into it. So do Google critical theory and Tim Keller and it'll come up. So, where were we? Goodies and baddies. We are all rasher. We all have the red ribbon of rasher on us. And if we're true and, and we know ourselves, we know that is to be the case. The Bible says the wages of sin is death, isn't it? Separation from God, from us, from each other, from our true relationships, all standing on boxes, scrambling to get to the top. And justice says, the law says, we should get our just deserts. So that's what sin has done. It's separated us. But what has justice done on the cross? And I want us to look very briefly at Luke 23, 11 to 25. You'll have noticed that we haven't had a reading, but I'm going to do the reading here in this moment. So Luke 23, 11 to 25. Jesus is being tried in a court before Herod and before Pilate. And hopefully some of it should come up on the screen here. Here we go. Luke 23 starts at 11. So then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. So he's in the court of Herod. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. This is an interesting aside that Luke gives us. That day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. I just find this a really interesting little aside here. The power structures within this kind of corrupt court, those in power aligning with each other and became friends around this moment. It's just strange. It's a sort of an ancient equivalent of the Bullingdon Club. Herod and Pilate became friends. Anyway, moving on. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and said to them, you brought this man, and this man is one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, so in the presence of the religious elite, the Jewish crowd, and I've found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Luke, who wrote this gospel, wants us to he's drawing attention to the corruption of the court and the innocence of Jesus. The only one who is not rasher, the only one who does not have the red ribbon over him, is the very one that actually is later put to death. And then it says, but the whole crowd shouted, away with this man, release Barabbas to us. And another aside he gives us, Barabbas had been thrown into prison for insurrection, incidentally the same charge that Jesus has received in the city, and for murder. You see who has the red ribbon of rasher on them. Did you know this? This is a really interesting little fact I find fascinating. And Barabbas means bar son. If you break those two words down, bar means son and Abba means father. So his name means son of the Father. And in Matthew's gospel, Matthew referenced him as Jesus Barabbas. So what we have in this courtroom, fascinating, what we have in this courtroom is we have two Jesus, son of Father. Amazing. Luke wants us to know and see what is happening here. And one has rasher. One is guilty. He is guilty. He should be condemned. That is what retributive justice would look like. But something amazing happens. You know, in it, one rules. One rules. Barabbas rules by taking the lives of others. The other, Jesus, rules by giving his own life. Fascinating. One wants to overthrow the king, and the other is the rightful king of the people. One is guilty, rasher, and will be set free. The other is innocent, but will be sentenced to death. But there is a massive travesty of justice in this kangaroo court. Pilate speaks to the crowd 3 times. But with the loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant them their demand. He does the easy and expedient thing. He says, oh, I can't be having with it. Okay, you have your way. And he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Now, this is not a new thought to many of you here. But it is worth being reminded of it, because Luke, who wrote this gospel, wants us to see it really clearly. Jesus took Barabbas' place on the cross. It was Barabbas' cross. He knew he was guilty. He had done the murder. He had done the insurrection. He was sitting in death row, waiting. And I'm always fascinated in what is not said. What an extraordinary character, son of the Father, Barabbas. This man took his cross. He took his cross. This innocent man that Pilate and Herod had declared innocent. But he took his cross. Barabbas, you got a second chance. What do I do? What does he do? How does he live his life? Who knows? But he got a second chance. He got a new life. He got a new life because Jesus took his place. And Luke wants us to see ourselves in this man. He wants us to put ourselves in his place. He bore the guilt and shame and curse and disgrace and death that Barabbas deserved. And what does Barabbas receive? He receives the release, the freedom, and the life that Jesus deserved. It's an extraordinary exchange. And it makes no sense. It doesn't make sense. Is this justice? I try and arbitrate between my kids when they're fighting over something. And they say, but Daddy, it's wrong because he's wrong and I'm right. And will you arbitrate correctly? And mishpat, justice, kind of doesn't make sense, does it? We don't get our just desserts. Like Barabbas, we sit in spiritual prison before we know Jesus, bound and awaiting our just desserts. It's what we deserve. But Jesus gets what I deserve, so I get what he deserves. It seems a bit unfair. I don't know. Does it? A little bit nonsensical, a little bit foolish. This is an interesting quotation. We've been looking at this book as we've been going through this preaching series, Embracing Justice. And she writes this is Isabel. At this heart of the cross, what stands as a monument to human foolishness, the cross, a monument to human foolishness, is turned into a witness to God's grace and a challenge, interesting, to rethink how we pursue justice and peace within human communities. It's grace. At the heart of it is grace. At the heart of our lives of justice is grace. And grace doesn't really make sense with our sense of justice, because it's completely undeserved. Barabbas was guilty. He was guilty, but he gets off. He didn't get his just deserts. But what do we get? So that is what justice is on the cross. And it's worth thinking about Barabbas. But what do we get? We get so much. What love has done. What has love done at the cross? We were singing it before. Amazing, amazing grace. I wonder if the band could come up now, actually. I'm going to wind down. What love has done. You see, at the cross, there is an amazing exchange that takes place. When we gaze at the foot of the cross, we realize that Jesus was punished that we might be forgiven. Jesus was wounded that we receive healing. You see this exchange that happens. Jesus was made sin with our sinfulness that we might be made righteous with his righteousness. Exchange. Jesus died our death that we might receive his life. Exchange. Jesus endured poverty that we might share his abundance. Jesus endured rejection that we might have his acceptance with the Father. Amazing. He was made a curse that we might enter the blessing. An exchange takes place. And I wonder, as I've just said that little list of what the things that have exchanged, is there one that your spirit drew to in that extraordinary, unfair exchange of mishpat, restorative justice, as we are restored to the Father through the cross, through what Jesus does. And it is from this place, and you're welcome to start playing, guys. It's from this place where we are justified. He takes the red rasher from our shoulders, and he places the grace and mercy and righteousness that is his, and he gives it to us. And we walk with that from a place of identity, of love, of a sense of being forgiven. That is mishpat. And in the film, and I love these two pictures, the film that I showed you earlier on about an hour ago. Sorry. Could we have that? Yes, here we go. Two little pictures that I really like. The mishpat, the restoration that we have been given, a mantle of grace, becomes in the picture a bullhorn. I love this. It becomes a bullhorn. Open your mouth for those who can't speak for themselves. We become the means of justice and righteousness in the world. We've been saying that over the last 5 weeks. We become the means. We can become his voice. What is he saying? And as I was writing this, it's not a new thought, but you know, we sang earlier this morning, I think it was "Break My Heart for what breaks yours." And this week I was writing this: open my mouth, Lord, for those who can't speak for themselves. Who do you want me to open my mouth for? And it's not really talked about from the front, but I sort of feel compelled, is this terrible, extraordinary statistic that 223,102 children are aborted in the UK every year, around that number. And I'm thinking, they can't speak for themselves. Is that a justice issue? Is that a bullhorn issue? And I felt the Lord say, yes, that breaks my heart. I know that there are really complex issues around this. Believe me, I know, we know. And I think, therefore, we don't really talk about it because it's so complicated and so difficult. And as a church, we've stopped thinking about it. But I just wanted to mention it. 70 million children, image bearers, are killed every year. 70 million. Open our mouths for those who can't speak for themselves. There are justice issues that God has put on our hearts. And it's not necessarily that one. I just wanted to say it from the front. And I wonder what it is to speak, to open our mouths for those who can't speak for themselves. And what is it? Can we go back to that picture, Paul? Sorry. And also the pulling up, and I love this. I love this. Who are we called to pull up? And I wonder, those two images, there's a bullhorn, speak. And it's often uncomfortable speaking, isn't it? It's really uncomfortable mentioning abortion. It feels awkward and difficult and painful. And I think when we speak into injustice, it often is, because we're speaking into systemic and we're speaking into areas that people don't want you to mention. And what about this one? Pulling up. So I wonder if you could stand with me now. Would that be all right? When we gaze upon the cross, we discover endless theology, endless revelation. We never tire of understanding the mystery of the cross. But we also understand something of God's heart for mishpat, restorative justice, and grace. We receive so much from the cross. We receive so much. And there's some of us here this evening who've never received anything from the cross. You've never heard about that exchange that's taken place. And maybe this evening will be an opportunity to come forward, and I'd love to say a prayer for you if you'd like that. And now's a good time for our prayer ministry team to come forward either side. And these are folk who would just love to stand with you, pray for you. If whatever might have come up this evening, and I've covered a few bits and bobs, but what I hope I've covered is the amazing grace of the cross, that we receive God's love. We receive the life of Christ at the cross. Some of you may be feeling a bit guilty at the moment, really aware of that rasher of the red ribbon. This evening, allow Jesus to replace it